At his ex-girlfriend's funeral, a millionaire CEO meets identical twins with golden hair and blue eyes who look exactly like him. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The rain drizzled softly on the sleek black coffin as people gathered under a cluster of umbrellas, their hushed whispers drowned out by distant thunder. Charles Bentley, a towering figure in the business world and CEO of Bentley Industries, stepped out of his limousine, head bowed under the brim of a dark hat. He was no stranger to funerals. Years of corporate struggles and personal sacrifice had left him with a deep respect for life's fragility, but today felt different, charged with an unexplainable tension that tugged at his nerves. He had come to pay respects to a longtime friend and mentor, Harold Tate, a man who had once guided him through some of the toughest decisions of his career. A handful of mourners in black suits and dresses hovered near the grave, softly murmuring condolences. The heavy, wet air pressed against Charles's lungs as he trudged across the sodden grass, each step echoing with memories of the older gentleman's advice. He remembered late-night phone calls, heated debates about the future of manufacturing, and the pride Harold had shown when Charles's first product line went global. Yet it was precisely this bittersweet recollection that made the funeral so difficult to face. Charles removed his hat, revealing hair the color of steel, then bowed his head for a moment. Nearby, the pastor's voice resonated with a solemn dignity. Raindrops slid down the polished surface of the casket, gathering at the edges before falling onto the ground. Charles held his breath, willing himself not to think of work, not to check his phone, not to do anything that might break the reverence of the moment. He had often been chastised for being too detached, too efficient, always the calculating businessman with no time for emotional distractions. But looking down at Harold's final resting place, he felt a hollow ache that reminded him he was still, in spite of everything, human. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Charles noticed two figures standing a short distance away. They were teenagers, twins from the look of it, appearing no older than 15 or 16. Both wore ill-fitting black attire as if they had hurriedly borrowed formal clothes. Hoods and damp hair clung to their faces, concealing their expressions. He assumed they might be distant relatives of Harold, perhaps grandchildren he had never met. But something about them held his attention, a subtle magnetism that made him glance over more than once. The boy and the girl each had the same striking green eyes, bright even through the dreary gloom, and those eyes were fixed not on the casket but on Charles himself. He felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't simply that they were staring, it was the uncanny recognition shining in their gaze, a look that suggested they knew him intimately. For a moment, his carefully composed demeanor faltered. He found himself turning fully to face them, ignoring the eulogies and the soft sound of the rain. The twins made no move, only continued to watch him with an intensity that caused Charles to tighten his grip on his umbrella. As the pastor concluded the final prayer and the small crowd began to disperse, Charles lingered. A part of him was reluctant to leave Harold behind, but he also felt compelled to confront the pair of teenagers whose presence unsettled him. He took a step toward them, his Italian leather shoes sliding slightly in the slick grass. The boy drew closer to his sister as Charles approached, as though shielding her from potential harm, but neither twin fled. When Charles came within earshot, he spoke gently, unsure why he felt uncharacteristically cautious. "Hello," he said, tipping his head in greeting. "Were you friends of Harold's?" The twins exchanged a glance. Their faces were eerily alike, high cheekbones, slender noses, and those piercing green eyes. Up close, Charles noticed the subtle differences. The girl's hair was a shade darker, the boy's chin slightly more angular. But the resemblance was so strong that they could never be mistaken for anything but siblings. After a tense pause, the girl answered. "We never met him," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the drizzle. "We're not here for Mr. Tate." Charles frowned. glancing around. The other mourners were stepping away, umbrellas tipping to and fro. The casket was being lowered gently into the ground. Now it was just him and these two teenagers, standing amid the hush of the cemetery and the relentless patter of rain. He glanced at them more carefully. Their clothes looked cheap, perhaps second-hand. The boy seemed thin in a way that spoke of missed meals rather than a natural build. And then there were their eyes that, for some inexplicable reason, looked like reflections of his own. "If you're not here for Harold, then why?" Charles began, but the girl cut him off. "We're here because of you." Her tone was steady, though her lower lip trembled from the chill. A sudden rush of dread and confusion slammed into Charles. He had grown used to strangers occasionally approaching him in public, investors, new entrepreneurs, or even reporters fishing for a quote. But no one had ever claimed to attend a funeral just to meet him. Before he could speak, the boy unzipped the pocket of his wet jacket and removed a small photograph. He extended it toward Charles, eyes unwavering. Charles took the photo, finding it smudged at the corners and faded from what looked like years of handling. With trembling fingers, he angled it under a sliver of weak sunlight penetrating the low clouds. It was a picture of him, about 2 decades younger, standing beside a woman he thought he had forgotten. Her name pounded through his head like an echo. Marissa Lane. They were in front of a small cottage by a lake, smiling without worry, as if they believed happiness was permanent. His breath caught, memories roaring to life. A summer fling, an intense connection that had abruptly ended when he set his sights on building his empire. His relationship with Marissa had been brief but powerful, overshadowed by the demands of ambition. He stared at the twins, his mind spinning. Marissa had never told him she was pregnant. She had never reached out, never sent so much as a letter to his office. Yet here were 2 living, breathing teenagers with eyes so similar to his it felt impossible to deny. "Who are you?" he whispered, the image in his hand shaking. "I'm Eva," the girl said. "This is my brother Luke." Charles fought to keep his composure. "Your mother, is she—" Luke's lips thinned, and the girl lowered her gaze. "She died last week," Eva said, a quiver in her voice. "We didn't have anyone else to contact." A sudden wave of guilt and sorrow rushed through Charles, and his knees nearly buckled. He never thought his youthful romance with Marissa would resurface after all these years, let alone in the form of twins he had unknowingly fathered. He wanted to deny it, to cling to the assurance that he would have known if something so important had happened. But their resemblance, especially the color of their eyes, made that denial nearly impossible. The boy glanced at the photograph in Charles's hand. "We found that picture in her belongings," he said quietly, "and letters she wrote but never sent. She mentioned you by name." Eva nodded, hugging herself. "We didn't know where else to go. We just lost her, and we recognized you from articles and TV interviews. We thought maybe—" Her voice trailed off, leaving an aching silence in its wake. Charles could guess what they were about to ask. They had no one in the world, and apparently he might be their only living relative. His heart pounded as he looked at their thin clothes, their trembling fingers, and the heartbreak etched on their faces. He had spent a lifetime burying regrets in an endless pursuit of success. But now, 2 living reminders of the past had shown up, carrying every reason for him to question everything he had built. "Did she ever say why she didn't tell me?" he asked softly. Eva dropped her gaze. "In one of her letters, she wrote that she tried to reach you in the early days, but your office never put her calls through. She said you'd moved on, that you were building your career. She thought she'd be in the way." Luke shifted uncomfortably. "She said you were better off not knowing, but she always kept that photo." Charles's chest tightened. He wondered what might have happened if Marissa's message had reached him. He wondered if his staff, more concerned with shielding him from distractions, had unknowingly cut him off from the truth. A swirl of regret clashed with the sense of responsibility blossoming in his gut. He wanted to talk to them alone, away from the prying eyes of the cemetery staff who were glancing curiously in their direction. He gestured to his limousine, voice trembling slightly. "Why don't we talk somewhere warmer?" Luke exchanged a quick look with Eva. Charles sensed their hesitation. After all, they had no idea who he really was beyond the glossy headlines. He might be just another rich man who brushed people aside. Part of him wanted to kneel down and promise them he would never abandon them again, but he had never been good with emotional confessions. He only managed a nod toward the waiting vehicle. "It's raining," he added gently. "We can go get coffee or tea, anything you like, just to talk." Eva bit her lip and nodded. Luke shrugged and tucked his hood tighter around his face. Together they made their way across the drenched grass, avoiding the headstones as the funeral staff finalized the ceremonies. Charles felt like a ghost moving among the living, his body numb with shock, his heart pounding with realization, his mind reeling from the fact that these two grieving teenagers might share his blood. When they reached the limousine, the driver opened the door, and Charles let the twins climb inside. The plush interior and tinted windows felt surreal in contrast to the gloom of the cemetery. As Charles settled into the seat across from them, the weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders. He had spent years making business deals, forging alliances, and building an empire that soared well beyond anything he'd once dreamed. Yet, in this quiet moment with two lost teenagers who stared at him with cautious hope, all of that wealth and power suddenly felt inconsequential. He met their gazes and tried to manage a reassuring smile. "Let's figure this out," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of uncertainty raging inside him. "Together." Before going further in this story, please like and share if you find it compelling, and consider following along for more. The driver closed the door with a soft click, and the limousine pulled smoothly away from the cemetery, the windshield wipers sweeping a thin layer of rain from the glass. Charles Bentley looked at the twins seated across from him on the luxurious leather bench, trying to quell the nerves fluttering inside his chest. He had closed deals worth billions, held press conferences in front of critical journalists, and faced corporate adversaries who would stop at nothing to see him fail. Yet somehow, the prospect of speaking to two teenagers he might have fathered left him uncharacteristically unsure of himself. Eva pressed her knees together, her damp sleeves rolled up slightly to reveal slender arms. Luke hunched forward, shoulders tense, his gaze flitting over the polished interior as though he were in an alien spaceship. Occasionally, Charles caught them casting side glances at him, but the twins looked away whenever he tried to hold their stare. The small table near them held a discreet box of tissues, and Eva reached for one, dabbing droplets of water from her face. The motion underscored how young and vulnerable they seemed, and Charles felt a surge of protectiveness that caught him off guard. He cleared his throat. "Thank you both for trusting me enough to come here," he began. A flicker of emotion crossed Luke's eyes, though he said nothing. Charles continued, voice measured. "I know this is sudden, and you have no reason to believe I belong in your lives. But I want to help, however I can." A brief silence followed his words, broken only by the muffled hum of the limousine's engine. Finally, Eva lifted her chin. "We don't need charity," she said carefully, as though choosing her words so she wouldn't sound ungrateful. We just have nowhere else to go. Our mom's funeral was 2 days ago. We didn't have money for a big service. She paused and her voice broke. Luke reached over to give her hand a reassuring squeeze. Charles swallowed hard. "I understand," he said softly. "I'm sorry for your loss. Marissa was someone I cared about." The memories pressed in, and he wrestled them back. He wanted to offer condolences, but it felt hollow. He hadn't been part of Marissa's life in years, and that fact stung more now than it ever had. The car slowed momentarily, turning onto a broader avenue. Buildings with tall facades and expensive storefronts flashed past, each a testament to the same wealth Charles had amassed. He had never questioned how empty it might all feel if he discovered that, in the grander scheme, he had missed out on something fundamental, like fatherhood. A knot formed in his throat. Luke stared at the cuffs of his too short dress pants. "Look," he said, if you don't want us around, just say so. We'll figure something else out." The bravado in his voice belied the tremble that rippled beneath his words. Charles's heart wrenched. "That's not what I'm thinking at all," he said firmly. "I want to help you, but first we need clarity. We don't know for certain that I'm your father." Eva seemed almost relieved that Charles had broached the topic. She shifted on the seat, pushing back a few loose strands of hair. "Mom never mentioned anyone else," she said quietly, her words carrying both certainty and sorrow. "We checked everything she left behind, letters, photos, a diary she kept. She wrote your name and a few entries from before we were born." Charles exhaled, his mind clicking through half-remembered details. That last summer with Marissa, how she had seemed more contemplative than usual, how she'd quietly insisted she needed to sort out her future alone. He remembered being hurt and confused, but business demands pulled him away, and soon they fell out of touch. The possibility that she had, in fact, tried to contact him filled him with remorse. He forced himself to sound calm. I can arrange to verify it all," he said. "But if the two of you are comfortable, in the meantime, I'd like to offer you a place to stay. My home is big enough. You can each have your own room. You won't need to worry about money for now." He looked at them, trying to read their expressions. "I don't want you out on the streets." Their expressions shifted from caution to relief, though the relief looked fragile. Luke crossed his arms. "Isn't that a lot of trouble?" he asked. "Just taking in two kids you barely know?" Charles almost laughed, but there was too much tension in his chest for it to come out naturally. "Trouble, yes," he admitted, his voice quiet, "but not in the way you might think. I don't see it as a burden. I see it as a responsibility, something I should have known about and handled years ago." Luke's posture softened. Eva reached for another tissue, pressing it to the corners of her eyes, as though determined not to cry. "Thank you," she whispered. They rode the rest of the way in silence, each lost in private thoughts. Charles stared out at the city and felt an unfamiliar pang, the sense of regret. He wondered how different everything would have been had he answered a phone call or read a message from Marissa 2 decades earlier. He wondered whether these two young people would have grown up in a stable home, whether Marissa might still be alive. The thoughts weighed on him, even though rationally he knew he couldn't undo the past. Eventually, the limousine pulled into the circular driveway of Charles's penthouse building. Night had fallen, and the building's facade glowed with warm yellow lights that flickered across the polished marble foyer. Charles led the twins inside, greeting the doorman with a curt nod. The doorman's eyes flicked with curiosity at the sight of the 2 teenagers trailing behind Charles, but he knew better than to voice any questions. A short elevator ride later, they stepped into Charles's spacious residence, a labyrinth of glass walls, modern decor, and expensive art. Luke whistled under his breath, his eyes scanning the open living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and panoramic view of the city. "This is different," he muttered. Eva remained silent, but she carried herself with rigid self-consciousness, as though terrified of knocking over a priceless sculpture. Charles tried to make the environment feel less intimidating. "Let me show you to your rooms," he suggested, hoping a smaller space might help them adjust. "We'll figure out all the other details once you're settled." He guided them down a long hallway, flicking on lights as they went. First, he opened a door to a cozy guest bedroom that overlooked a quiet courtyard. A plush bed was neatly made with white linens, and a large dresser stood against the wall. Next door was a slightly larger room with a view of the skyline, equally pristine. The twins looked from one room to the other, wordlessly deciding who would take which. Luke eventually shrugged and chose the one facing the courtyard, while Eva stepped into the room with the city view. Charles left them for a moment, letting them absorb the strange reality of having a place to call their own, even if temporarily. He returned to the living room and sank onto a sectional couch, a wave of exhaustion coursing through him. His phone buzzed, a text from his secretary, Jessica, reminding him about a conference call the next morning. It felt surreal to think about heading into a high-stakes meeting now that his personal life had cracked wide open. He texted a quick acknowledgement, set the phone aside, and rubbed his temples. He knew he'd need to contact a lawyer soon, begin official processes, maybe arrange DNA testing, but he was determined to approach everything in a way that protected Eva and Luke from further upheaval. They had already lost their mother. They didn't need a messy legal battle on top of that. He was still thinking about how to proceed when Eva and Luke emerged from the hallway. Eva spoke first, quietly. "Thank you for letting us stay," she said. "We don't know how long. We won't impose too much." "You're not imposing," Charles replied. He tried to offer a reassuring smile. "It's late. Are you hungry?" Luke nodded reluctantly. "We haven't eaten since breakfast. We were at the funeral home most of the day, then went to the cemetery." Charles felt a stab of guilt. "I'll order something. Any preferences?" They exchanged a glance, shrugging almost in unison. "Pizza," Eva said tentatively, as though suspecting a wealthy man like Charles wouldn't allow junk food in his pristine home. Charles nodded. "Pizza it is. I'll call for it right now." He paused, eyeing them. "Would you like to shower or change? I can lend you some clothes until we can buy you proper things." Luke looked down at his own soggy outfit. "That'd be great if you have anything that fits," he mumbled. "But I'm not exactly your size." Charles chuckled softly. "We'll manage. I have sweatpants that might at least be comfortable until tomorrow. Eva, I can find some shirts for you to sleep in too." A short while later, the twins disappeared into the bathrooms. Charles made the phone call to a nearby gourmet pizza place, requesting 2 large pies with a variety of toppings. Once the order was placed, he collected some oversized t-shirts, sweatpants, and hoodies from his closet, hoping they wouldn't mind wearing clothes that didn't quite match. He left the bundles outside their doors. With the main lights dimmed, the penthouse felt calmer, the soft hum of the climate control the only sound punctuating the hush. It gave Charles time to reflect. Only hours ago, he had been standing in the rain at Harold's funeral, intending to pay final respects and leave. Now, he was standing at the threshold of a completely different life, a life he hadn't imagined in any of his meticulously organized plans. He couldn't deny the slow but insistent stir of emotion blossoming inside him. Guilt, yes, for not knowing what Marissa had gone through, but also a strange, cautious sense of hope that maybe, despite the tragedy and heartache, he could do something meaningful for these children. The idea of living with them, guiding them, supporting them, if they truly were his, felt terrifying, like stepping into unfamiliar territory without a map. Yet it also stirred a spark he hadn't felt in years, something that reached beyond profit margins and company shares. A knock on the door broke his reverie. The delivery had arrived. Charles hurried to fetch the pizzas, signing the receipt and thanking the courier. By the time Eva and Luke re-emerged, wearing the mismatched sweatpants and hoodies, a warm, savory aroma filled the living room. Charles spread the boxes on the coffee table and motioned for them to join him. They sat around the table's edge, and he noticed how eagerly they each grabbed a slice. Teenage hunger, overriding awkwardness. For a few moments, they ate quietly. Then Luke spoke. "You said we should figure out how to confirm everything," he said, swirling the crust in his hand. "I guess we want that too. Proof." His eyes flicked up, timid but resolute. "I hope you're okay with that." Charles nodded. "Of course," he said gently. "That makes sense for both of us." Eva watched him carefully, her expression a mix of exhaustion and curiosity. "What if you aren't our father after all?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "Would you send us away?" That question lanced through him. He set down his slice of pizza, mouth dry. I don't know," he confessed. Honesty felt like the only approach. "But I know that right now you both need a place to stay. That doesn't have to change just because the test might say otherwise." Eva blinked. Slowly she nodded, as though she'd been bracing for a rejection that hadn't come. "Okay," she said, her voice almost too soft to hear. And in that moment, Charles realized that they were as cautious and analytical as he was, gauging risks, testing the waters, ready to retreat at the first sign of trouble. He tried to offer a small smile. "We'll handle things one step at a time. Tomorrow we can go shopping for clothes. Maybe find you some essentials for school. Or if you need tutoring, we'll figure that out." Luke raised an eyebrow. "School's been disrupted," he said bluntly. "We were kicked out of our last place and Mom couldn't keep up the rent. We ended up staying in some friend's basement for a while." Hearing that reminded Charles how harrowing their journey must have been. "We'll make sure you get back on track," he promised. Eventually, the talk waned. All three of them were tired, each for different reasons. Eva and Luke slipped back to their new rooms, murmuring goodnights. Charles sat alone in the living room for a long time, gazing at the skyline. He found himself silently praying for clarity. If the tests proved the twins were indeed his, he'd have to shoulder a responsibility he had never imagined. If they weren't, he had no idea how he'd manage to let them walk away. Weariness finally overtook him, and he retired to his own bedroom, though rest wouldn't come easily. Even as he closed his eyes, the faces of Eva and Luke and the memory of Marissa swirled in his mind. He felt poised on the edge of a precipice, caught between regret and the faint promise of redemption. By morning, he'd have to push forward no matter how uncertain he felt, because something told him that if he did right by them, he might yet find the part of his life he never realized was missing. Morning light streamed through the towering windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. Charles Bentley woke with a start, his heart thudding from a fitful sleep. The night had been restless. Dreams of Marissa standing beside a lake, calling his name, chased him through a fog. Shaking off the remnants, he dressed quickly and exited his bedroom to find the penthouse in hushed stillness. Eva and Luke were likely still asleep. Checking the time, Charles noticed it was already past 8, much later than his usual start. He stared at his phone, scrolling through emails that demanded his attention, a contract renewal, a pending merger, and a scheduling reminder for a board meeting. The normal routine of his life felt oddly jarring now. After everything that had transpired, reading about profit margins and production lines seemed trivial. He brewed a pot of coffee, its aroma lending a momentary comfort. Then, stepping to the kitchen island, he decided to check on the twins. Their doors remained closed, so he gave a gentle knock on Luke's first. There was a rustle before the door opened a crack, revealing Luke's sleepy face. "Morning," Charles said quietly. "I wanted to let you know I'm making breakfast, or, well, attempting to." It occurred to him that he couldn't recall the last time he'd cooked more than toast for himself. Luke blinked, stifling a yawn. "Okay," he mumbled. "We'll be out soon." Charles nodded and moved on to Eva's door, offering a gentle knock. She responded with a muffled acknowledgement. Satisfied that neither would be taken by surprise, he headed back to the kitchen and began rummaging through cabinets in the fridge. He settled on eggs, bread, and a package of fresh fruit. Simple enough, he told himself. By the time the twins emerged, wearing the oversized sweatpants and t-shirts he had lent them, Charles was shoveling scrambled eggs onto plates, trying not to burn the toast. Ava ventured to the table, raising her eyebrows at the sight of him in front of the stove. Luke followed, eyeing the plates with a guarded sort of hope. They might have been uncertain about everything else in their future, but they were definitely hungry. "How did you sleep?" Charles asked, dividing the eggs into 2 neat portions and sliding them in front of Eva and Luke. "Better than I expected," Eva admitted, sounding shy. "It's really quiet here." Luke nodded, voice still groggy. "We're used to more noise and smaller spaces." Charles felt a pang of guilt. He couldn't begin to imagine how cramped or chaotic their living situation must have been before all this. "Well, I hope you'll get used to it," he said, placing glasses of juice on the table, "at least for now." They ate in silence for a few minutes. Charles considered how best to raise the matter of paternity testing. Bringing it up at breakfast might be abrupt, but it was necessary. Finally, he ventured, "About those tests we mentioned last night. My lawyer can arrange them today if you'd like to start that process." Eva paused mid-bite. "Do we have to go somewhere, or?" "There's a private clinic," Charles replied. "They can do a swab for DNA comparison. It won't take long." He hesitated. "They'll need you both to sign a form since you're minors, but it's simple. I can handle the financial side." Neither twin spoke for a moment, but eventually Luke shrugged. "Might as well get it over with." Eva nodded in agreement, though she looked anxious. She focused on her eggs, picking at them as if her appetite had vanished. Charles noted it, but decided not to press. He remembered how he'd felt each time he'd faced a major turning point in his career, the swirl of doubt, the fear of an outcome you couldn't control. He was certain the twins felt something similar now, though multiplied by the emotional loss of their mother. Shortly after breakfast, Charles called his legal advisor, a pragmatic woman named Jocelyn Rain. Within the hour, Jocelyn set the appointment for early afternoon. The rest of the morning was spent in a flurry of new routines. Charles showed them the penthouse's entertainment system, offered them free rein of the living space, and mentioned that they could pick out books from his small library if they wanted to read. He also handed them gift cards and suggested they consider online shopping for new clothes, reminding them that he'd accompany them to a proper store as soon as they were ready. Luke gave a quiet thanks. Eva, fiddling with the hem of the hoodie she wore, looked shy, yet curious. "So, you really don't mind if we order what we need?" she asked. It was as though she expected him to revoke his offer any moment. "Not at all," he assured her. "Order whatever sizes or styles you prefer. It's important you're comfortable." His tone was gentler than any he used with his colleagues or business partners. The shift in his own voice startled him. By the time early afternoon rolled around, Jocelyn arrived, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. She greeted Charles with a handshake and nodded politely at Eva and Luke. "I'll accompany you to the clinic," she explained. "It's discreet. No paparazzi or onlookers. We'll process the results as quickly as confidentiality allows." "Thank you," Charles said, ushering the twins into the private elevator that led down to his car. "I appreciate you making this easy on us." Jocelyn offered a measured smile. "Anything to help you, Mr. Bentley?" Then she turned to the twins, her voice adopting a gentler note. "I know it's a stressful time. I'll make sure your privacy is respected." They rode in the back of Charles's sedan through city traffic, the passing storefronts and skyscrapers reflecting off the windows. Eva rested her forehead against the glass, seemingly lost in thought. Luke stared at the passing cars. occasionally shooting side glances at Charles as if searching for any clue about how the day might unfold. Charles wished he could project calm and confidence, but he was too aware of the storm inside his own mind. Eventually, they arrived at a discreet medical building on a quiet side street. Jocelyn guided them to a small laboratory suite, where a technician greeted them with a polite smile. The process was straightforward: a quick swab inside the cheek for each of them, some paperwork signed in black ink, and a promise of preliminary results within a few days. Eva and Luke's signatures, scrawled in a teenager's rushed hand, looked heartbreakingly out of place on legal documents with Charles's bold signature. When the forms were done, the technicians sealed the swabs and thanked them. Jocelyn lingered, verifying details and discussing next steps in hushed tones. Charles noticed Eva's hands were clenched at her sides, so he gave her a small nod of reassurance. Luke hovered by the door, foot tapping, posture stiff. The tension in the air was palpable. "Everything's set," Jocelyn confirmed. "I'll call you the moment we hear anything." They stepped back outside into the fresh air. The sky hung gray, threatening another round of drizzle. Charles didn't want to drag the twins back to the penthouse right away, not with them still looking so uneasy. "Would you like to get lunch somewhere?" he asked. "Or maybe see more of the city?" Eva exchanged a glance with Luke, uncertainty evident in both their gazes. Finally, Luke shrugged. "Sure," he said. "We haven't exactly done much sightseeing." Charles felt a small surge of relief. "Let's do it. There's a diner I used to visit near my old office. It's not fancy, but it's got the best milkshakes in the city." Eva almost smiled. "That sounds nice," she said softly. They piled back into the car. Charles directed the driver to a humble diner tucked between high-rises, a place he recalled from his early career days when money was tight and ambition was all he had. At first, he'd been the young upstart with big dreams. This diner had fueled him through countless late nights of planning. And now, in a twist that felt almost surreal, he was bringing two teens who might be his children to the very spot where he'd once hoped to make something of himself. They slid into a booth near the back, the vinyl seats a comforting contrast to the sterile environment of the clinic. A jukebox glowed in the corner, humming with possibilities. An elderly waitress approached, setting down laminated menus and greeting them with a friendly smile. Charles ordered a burger, Luke gravitated toward a chicken sandwich, and Eva opted for a Caesar salad. And after some deliberation, they all decided on milkshakes. Chocolate for Luke, vanilla for Eva, and strawberry for Charles. The waitress vanished, leaving them with small cups of water and a moment to fill with conversation. Luke traced patterns on the table with a fingertip. "How long did you live in this city before you got rich?" he asked abruptly. Charles leaned forward. "I moved here right after college. I worked for a few small companies, then took out loans and started my own. It took years. In the beginning, I couldn't afford my rent. I'd come here for a cheap meal and dream about the day I'd make it big." Eva glanced around. "It doesn't feel like a place big-shot CEOs go," she observed, her tone neutral. Charles gave a small, wry laugh. "I guess I'm not the typical CEO then. Or maybe I am, but I like to remember where I started." As though summoned by the memory, his mind flickered back to that younger version of himself, idealistic, terrified of failure, scrambling for the next venture. He wondered how Marissa fit into that timeline. Did she drop by the diner with him once or twice? He recalled maybe bringing her here late one night, but the details were hazy. She'd been so warm, so full of promise. The regret of not staying in touch still clawed at him. The waitress returned with tall glasses of milkshakes. Luke took a long sip, eyes lighting up at the rich flavor. Eva gave a contented hum as she tried hers. Charles tasted his own and found it exactly as he remembered, frothy, sweet, tinged with nostalgia. He studied their faces, noticing the first flickers of relaxation since the morning. Perhaps the normalcy of a diner booth, the promise of a decent meal, and the taste of something sweet were easing their tension. He took that as a small victory. When the waitress brought their entrees, Charles asked, "Have you thought about where you might like to go to school? Either back to public school or maybe a private option, if that's better." Eva swallowed. "We were attending a public school in a different district. Mom kept moving, so it was never stable. I didn't want to leave in the middle of a year." Luke joined in, quiet frustration lacing his tone. "The last place we lived was behind on bills. We got evicted. We left school 2 months before final exams." Charles felt a surge of anger at a world that would treat them this way, and at himself for not being there, ignorant of their hardships. "Well," he said, voice steady, "I'll see to it that you can enroll somewhere without worrying about being moved again. We can figure out tutoring to catch up on missed material. Maybe I can hire someone to help." Luke put his sandwich down, regarding Charles with an unreadable expression. "Why are you doing all this?" he asked, not in anger but in genuine puzzlement. "If the test shows you're not our father, you could just wash your hands of us." Charles paused, setting his burger aside. He met Luke's gaze, unblinking. "I can't pretend you two don't exist," he said quietly. "You found me at a funeral. We shared photos, memories of Marissa. Even if this test says otherwise, you've already changed my life by walking into it." He inhaled, letting the intensity of his words settle. "I'm not abandoning you." Eva set her fork down, tears welling in her eyes. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The waitress passed again, mistaking the silence for an interruption in conversation and leaving the check discreetly on the table. Charles cleared his throat and grabbed it, sliding a credit card inside without glancing at the total. In the hush that followed, Luke finally spoke. "I guess we should say thanks," he murmured. "You've given us more than anyone else has in a long time." "You don't have to thank me," Charles replied. "I should have been there." Eva sniffled, her eyes dropping to her plate. "Mom always said you were a good man," she said softly. "She just didn't think she fit into your world." Hearing that, Charles had to close his eyes to steady himself. Guilt twisted in his stomach, even as a sad kind of warmth spread through his chest. Maybe the path he'd taken in life had pushed people away, Marissa included. Maybe she'd worried that success and fatherhood wouldn't mesh. He opened his eyes to see the twins watching him, their expressions both guarded and hopeful. He realized it was the same way he probably looked to them, uncertain, guilty, but daring to hope that they could piece together some kind of family from the fragments they had. With a small breath, he slid out of the booth. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's head back. We've all had a long day, and tomorrow we can talk about next steps." They followed him outside. The sky had grown darker, and the first drops of rain spattered onto the sidewalk. Charles retrieved an umbrella from the car and held it over them as best he could, shepherding the twins into the sedan. Once inside, the city lights glinted off the windows, painting Eva's and Luke's faces in shifting hues of neon. Charles wondered if they noticed the way every passing minute changed the direction of their futures. He certainly felt it, a transformation in the air, unstoppable and profound. They drove off, leaving behind the diner and the fragile illusions Charles once held about his neatly ordered life. Ahead lay the unknown, shaped by swab results in a sterile lab, by a woman's diary entries from years past, and by two teenagers who never asked to be thrust into the center of this story. Part of Charles dreaded the confrontation with the test results, but another part couldn't deny the flicker of anticipation. Perhaps, just perhaps, a twist of fate had chosen this moment to offer him a second chance he never knew he needed. Before going further in this story, please like and share if you find it compelling, and consider following along for more. When the sedan pulled up beneath the penthouse awning, the drizzle had turned into a lazy mist drifting through the glow of streetlights. Charles ushered Eva and Luke inside, nodding briefly to the doorman, who seemed unable to hide his curiosity at the sight of the two teenagers. Once on the private elevator, no one spoke. The twins stood close together, subdued by the weight of their long day. Charles stole occasional glances at them, acutely aware that they were in the midst of an ordeal that few their age would ever face. Back in the penthouse, the quiet seemed almost overwhelming. The ambient lighting reflected against gleaming floors, and a faint hum from the climate control system underscored just how large and solitary the space was. Eva took a seat on the couch, setting her hands in her lap as though uncertain what else to do. Luke headed straight for the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing a hand against the glass as he looked out over the shimmering city. Charles flicked on a lamp near the sofa, adding a softer glow. "I know you're both tired," he said, his voice low and measured. "But before you turn in, let's talk for just a minute. We might not have the test results until a few days from now, so I want us to have some sense of plan or routine." Eva nodded, turning toward him. "Okay," she murmured. She seemed more composed than she had at the diner, though her expression was still tinged with exhaustion. Luke turned from the view and sat at the far end of the couch, leaving a respectful gap between himself and Eva. Charles stood near the coffee table, arms crossed. He realized he'd never had to discuss living arrangements with anyone, besides staff or short-term guests. "I'll have my assistant Jessica gather some references for possible schools," he began. "That way you can look them over before we make any decisions. If that feels too rushed, we can consider tutors or online programs temporarily. I don't want to uproot you again, but it's important you're back on track." Luke let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. "It's hard to imagine going somewhere full-time," he admitted. "We've been missing classes for weeks. They might not even let us back in the same grade." "We'll figure it out," Charles promised. "If you need to repeat certain coursework, that's nothing to be ashamed of. Everyone's path is different, and the point is to keep moving forward." Eva toyed with a lock of hair, glancing around at the immaculate surroundings. "Do you work from home or something? We've seen you take calls, but we don't really know what you do during the day." Her question surprised him, though he realized it was perfectly natural. "I usually go into the corporate offices downtown," he explained. "I'm the CEO of Bentley Industries. We design and manufacture a range of technologies and consumer goods. Lately, though, I've been handling a lot of things remotely. It's easier with global time zones, but I also keep a boardroom schedule for critical decisions." Luke raised an eyebrow. "So you're in charge of a whole company?" Charles couldn't help a small smile. "Yes, a large one, but I have a lot of capable people working alongside me. It's not something I do alone." Eva nodded thoughtfully. "Does that mean you'll be gone most days?" "I can be around more if you need me," Charles said, sincerity lacing his voice. "I've built a good executive team who can handle things. Honestly, my biggest concern right now is that you two have what you need. The business can manage without me hovering over every detail." The teens exchanged a quick glance. Charles caught a flicker of relief in Eva's eyes, though Luke looked less certain. Charles wondered if they were still braced for some abrupt shift, as though any moment he might withdraw his offers of help and send them away. The thought tightened something in his chest. He despised the notion that they might not yet believe in his genuine intent. He cleared his throat, changing the subject gently. "If you're hungry again, let me know. Otherwise, feel free to shower or do whatever helps you relax. Tomorrow, maybe we can pick up a few more items, or at least go to a store in person if you'd prefer that to online shopping." Luke gave a quick nod, then rose from the couch. "I think I'll just go crash," he muttered, stifling a yawn. It's been a lot. Eva followed suit, gathering the edges of her borrowed sweatpants to keep them from trailing on the floor. "Good night," she whispered. "Thanks, Charles." She hesitated, then offered him the smallest hint of a smile before disappearing into the hallway. Luke trailed after her. Charles remained rooted in place, listening to their footsteps fade into the quiet corridors. He realized he was holding his breath again. Only when he heard two separate doors close did he finally exhale. Slowly, he sank into an armchair, leaning his head back. The sense of relief he felt was fleeting, overshadowed by the swirl of emotions that threatened to consume him. Had he truly made the right decision by bringing them into his home before the DNA results were official? Rationally, yes. He knew the two of them had nowhere else to go, and they clearly needed stability. Emotionally, though, he wondered if he was setting all three of them up for heartbreak if the test proved negative. He told himself he was prepared, but was he? He brushed a hand across his face. Business negotiations, corporate battles, he knew how to handle those. But personal entanglements had always been his greatest weakness. Marissa, of course, had been part of that vulnerability, and it had cost him an entire future he hadn't even known was on the table. If these teenagers weren't his, he'd only be prolonging their uncertainty. Yet if they were, he was on the cusp of fatherhood well past the time most men experienced it. Either option carried a sting. Sleep came fitfully. He lay in bed, eyes shut, mind wide awake. Hour after hour, he willed the night to hurry by. Eventually, sometime after midnight, he drifted into a dream where he stood at the edge of a calm lake. Marissa's silhouette appeared on the opposite shore, but whenever he called her name, his voice made no sound. The next morning, he awoke to find sunlight streaming through the curtains, mocking the heaviness in his chest. Despite the tension, Charles pushed himself to go through some version of his typical routine: a shower, a clean suit, a quick glance at business emails. He was about to phone his driver when he remembered the promise he'd made to Eva and Luke about going to a clothing store. So he texted Jessica, requesting she move his late morning commitments. Just as he put his phone down, he heard soft footsteps. Luke appeared, wearing the same borrowed clothes from the night before. The teenager looked slightly awkward, as though he'd realized how old and baggy the garments were in proper daylight. "Morning," he said. "Eva's still getting ready." Charles gestured toward the kitchen. "Help yourself to whatever you like. There's cereal, fruit, eggs, or we can pick something up on the way. My assistant rearranged my schedule so I can take you both out." Luke sank onto a stool by the kitchen island. "Thanks," he replied, fiddling with the edge of the counter. "I'm not used to people doing stuff for me." "It'll take time," Charles said sympathetically. "I understand. You can just let me know if anything makes you uncomfortable, or if you'd rather handle certain things yourself." Luke nodded, his brow furrowing. "I just don't want to feel like a burden or something." Charles's stomach knotted at those words, so painfully candid. "You're not a burden," he insisted, meeting Luke's gaze. "I promise." Before Luke could respond, Eva joined them, running fingers through her hair. "Morning," she greeted softly. She gave Luke a shy look, then faced Charles. "I'm ready whenever you are." "Great," Charles said. "Let's make our first stop somewhere for breakfast, then a store for clothes. Sound all right?" They agreed with subdued curiosity, and the three of them took the elevator to the ground floor. Charles's sedan arrived moments later. The driver opened the door, discreetly avoiding eye contact in the practiced manner of all high-profile chauffeurs. Luke and Eva settled in the back seat while Charles slid in next to them, noticing how the two teenagers huddled close, as if clinging to each other's reassuring presence. He directed the driver toward a mid-range department store with a decent reputation for teen apparel. Nothing too ostentatious, just practical clothes. But first they pulled into a small cafe, where Charles ordered pastries and hot chocolate for the twins, letting them devour the sweet confections at a small table. He watched them with a faint smile. They had the voracious appetite of teenagers, which momentarily eclipsed all other worries. Once they finished, the driver whisked them to the department store. Charles led them through the glass doors and into a bustling, brightly lit space filled with racks of sweaters, jeans, and jackets. Sales associates in neat uniforms offered polite greetings. The twins looked overwhelmed at first. Eva fidgeted with the strap of her borrowed purse, while Luke kept blinking at the sheer volume of items. Neither moved until Charles nudged them gently. "Go ahead," he encouraged. "Pick what you like. Don't worry about the price. We'll get you enough to tide you over for a while. Think about what you'd wear to school, to relax, everything." They exchanged glances. Luke cleared his throat. "Okay," he said, sounding more timid than usual. Then they split up, Eva toward the girls' section, Luke toward the men's juniors' side. Charles hovered at the periphery, feeling slightly useless but also relieved that the twins were taking initiative. He watched as Luke began thumbing through racks of jeans, occasionally glancing down at his own legs to estimate sizing. Eva carefully selected a few shirts, holding them up to gauge color and fit. Now and then, they looked Charles's way, seeking confirmation. He gave them a thumbs up, stepping closer only if they signaled for help. After so many years of making decisions that affected thousands of employees, it was strangely refreshing to stand there and let two uncertain teenagers find their sense of agency. When it came time to try things on, they disappeared into the fitting rooms. Charles paced near the entrance, ignoring the quizzical stares from other shoppers. His phone buzzed with an email reminder for a product update meeting. He quickly dismissed it. His head was too full of Eva and Luke's concerns to focus on corporate expansions. Luke emerged first, wearing a pair of black jeans and a hoodie. "How does it look?" he asked, shifting awkwardly. Charles broke into a genuine smile. "Looks good. Does it feel comfortable?" Luke nodded. "Better than baggy sweatpants anyway." A moment later, Eva stepped out, hugging a soft green sweater to her body. She studied herself in the mirror, fingertips grazing the fabric. "I like it," she murmured, "but I'm not sure if it's too expensive." Charles's smile gentled. "If you like it, we'll get it." She ducked her head, cheeks coloring. "I do like it," she said quietly. "Thank you." They took turns trying different outfits, amassing a moderate stack of purchases. By the time they reached the checkout counter, Eva and Luke looked more at ease, each carrying bags stuffed with new clothes. They even teased each other a bit about their style choices. A small, normal moment that gladdened Charles's heart. Watching them, he felt a stirring of hope that maybe they could build a life together, no matter what the DNA test said. The cashier rang up the items with a polite efficiency that Charles secretly appreciated. He handed over his corporate card, ignoring the curious glance the cashier gave him when she noticed the sheer amount of teen apparel in the hall. She bagged everything neatly, and Charles thanked her before guiding the twins back outside. They settled into the sedan once more, stowing the bags on the seats. Luke rested his head against the window. Eva clutched her seatbelt, gazing out at the sidewalk. Charles sensed their subdued relief, as though they were realizing that if nothing else, they wouldn't have to worry about day-to-day essentials for a while. "Feel better?" he asked, glancing between them. Luke snorted softly. "I guess it's nice not wearing the same ratty clothes every day." Eva gave a small laugh. "It is," she admitted. Then she fell silent, and Charles imagined her mind wandering to Marissa, wondering if her mother had ever envisaged them going on a shopping trip with the father she'd kept hidden for so long. Charles cleared his throat gently. "We'll take these home, and then maybe we can talk about school options. I don't want to push too hard, but I do think it's important to have a plan." Eva's expression clouded. "You're right," she said. "We can't just wait forever." Luke gave her a sidelong glance. We can handle it." Charles nodded approvingly. "One step at a time," he echoed. On the ride back, the sky lightened as clouds drifted off. Sunbeams caught on the skyscrapers, turning windows to mirrors that reflected the city's pulse. Charles watched Eva and Luke exchange a brief moment of unspoken understanding, a closeness formed by hardship and shared loss. He didn't want to intrude on that bond. Instead, he promised himself that whatever happened, he would do his best to make them feel wanted. Even if the test showed no biological link, even if the lawyers raised complications, these two deserved the security they'd been denied. And if they did turn out to be his children, well, then he hoped he could learn to be a decent father, even at this late juncture in his life. When they arrived at the penthouse, Charles stepped out and helped them carry their new belongings upstairs. As the elevator doors whispered open, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished metal. A man in a tailored suit, arms full of shopping bags intended for two wary teenagers who had stumbled into his life at a funeral. The contrast struck him powerfully. He wasn't sure which part of that image felt more surreal, the corporate success or the improvised parenthood, but in that fleeting instant, he felt a sense of purpose far different from anything work had ever offered. Before the day was out, he would check emails, return calls, and probably juggle some corporate fires. But for now, guiding Eva and Luke into the safety of his home and into the future they both deserved, took precedence. And for the first time in a long while, Charles Bentley felt like he was doing something that genuinely mattered in ways no business venture ever could. Before going further in this story, please like and share if you find it compelling, and consider following along for more. Charles closed the door behind them, setting his keys on a small tray near the entrance. The penthouse seemed calmer than usual, a hush that underscored the new routine he was trying to establish. Outside, the weather had turned bright, but the overhead lights in the foyer still provided a soft glow against the polished marble floors. Eva and Luke followed him to a side hallway, arms laden with bags, their expressions a mix of relief and fatigue. "Here," Charles said, gesturing to the hallway table. "You can drop off your things if you want. We'll sort everything in your rooms in a moment." Eva slid her shopping bags onto the surface, nodding gratefully. Luke did the same, though his focus seemed to wander as he took in the space. The hallway's tall windows offered a view of neighboring buildings, and the reflection of midday sun glinted off glass facades beyond the penthouse. Luke let out a slow breath, as though the city itself was an endless puzzle he couldn't quite decode. Charles felt a brief surge of awkwardness, the same flicker of uncertainty that hit him whenever he remembered how new this entire situation was. He cleared his throat. "I'll get us something to drink. Water, juice, soda. Any preference?" "Water's fine," Eva said softly. Luke nodded in agreement. While they settled themselves, Charles went to the kitchen and retrieved 3 glasses of chilled water. His phone buzzed on the counter, and he saw a message from Jocelyn, his lawyer. "Just checking in. We'll let you know if I hear any updates on test results. No news yet." He breathed out slowly, picking up the phone to send a quick reply. "Understood. Keep me posted." The thought of those pending results tugged at him every hour, but he reminded himself that the labs needed time to guarantee accuracy. Rushing them wouldn't do anyone any favors. When he returned to the hallway, Eva was crouched beside her bags, rifling through a few folded shirts as though double-checking what she had chosen. Luke stood at the window, gazing out. Charles held out the water glasses, and they thanked him. The simple domesticity of the moment reminded him of how drastically his life had changed in a matter of days. "Shall we unpack?" he suggested. "Or would you rather rest?" Eva glanced up. "I can put some of this away," she said. I like to know where my clothes are." She gave a tentative half-smile, which Charles took as progress in her comfort level. Luke shrugged, running a thumb over his glass. "I'll do the same. Not sure I'll rest much until we find out what's next." Charles tried to gauge Luke's mood. The boy had a guarded way of speaking, carefully calibrating how much he revealed. Charles understood. Trust wasn't something the twins could freely give, not after years of precarious housing and the recent loss of their mother. "If you need help with anything," he said gently, "just let me know." They split off to their respective rooms, clothes rustling in plastic bags as they moved. Left alone in the hallway, Charles lingered, studying the wide windows that framed the city. A surge of memories washed over him. The funeral, the first glimpse of Eva and Luke, that old photograph of him and Marissa. It felt like his whole life had shifted into a new orbit. He wondered if he'd wake up one morning and find it had all been a dream. With a small shake of his head, he headed to his office, determined to handle a few pressing work tasks. The large desk bore neat stacks of documents, each one a testament to a business empire that once defined his identity. Now it all felt secondary. He booted up his computer and skimmed through urgent emails, product launch updates, partnership inquiries, staff matters that required his approval. After half an hour, he realized he hadn't truly absorbed anything he read. Every message seemed trivial compared to the silent question of whether Eva and Luke were, in fact, his children. He rubbed his temples and stood, deciding perhaps a walk around the apartment would clear his head. Halfway down the corridor, he heard faint laughter coming from Luke's room. Intrigued, he approached quietly and glimpsed through the open doorway. Luke and Eva were sitting on the floor amid a sea of new clothes, exchanging quips as they folded t-shirts and placed them into dresser drawers. The tension on Luke's face had softened, replaced by something akin to sibling banter. Eva giggled at some private joke and Luke smirked as he tried to hang up a jacket twice his size. Charles felt an unexpected warmth bloom in his chest. It was the first time he had heard them laugh so naturally. Without wanting to intrude, he retreated, stepping softly back down the hall. Let them have this moment, he told himself, a moment to feel normal. They didn't need him hovering like a manager waiting for results. Retreating to the living room, he tapped out a message to Jessica, his assistant. "If you can, please gather info on local public and private schools that can accommodate 2 teenagers in mid-semester, possibly online or tutoring as well. Thanks." He placed his phone on the coffee table and stared around the high-ceiling space. Everything was still immaculate. Modern sculptures, sleek couches, a glass wall that showcased the skyline. It struck him that he'd never really personalized the penthouse. No family portraits hung on the walls, no worn-out furniture with sentimental value. He'd favored minimalism in every design choice, equating clutter with inefficiency. Yet at that very moment, he realized he would have given anything to have an old photograph of Marissa and the twins displayed. The emptiness felt glaring. Time passed slowly. He flipped on the television, barely paying attention to the financial news anchor droning about market fluctuations. Another half-hour later, Eva and Luke emerged, both looking more at ease in their new attire. Luke wore fresh jeans and a plain blue t-shirt. Eva had changed into fitted black pants and the green sweater she'd tried on at the store. She looked hesitantly proud of her choice, smoothing the fabric over her wrists. They settled on the couch, leaving a space between them and Charles. A small, companionable hush fell over the room. The new clothes had already banished some of the anxious tension that had clung to them. Charles turned off the television and faced them. "So," he said, clearing his throat, "I asked my assistant to gather information about schools and any bridging options. We can look over everything soon if you want." Eva nodded, though a crease appeared on her brow. "I do want to go back," she said quietly. "It's just a lot to think about. We don't even know if we're staying here long term." Charles inclined his head. "That's fair, but no matter the DNA results, you can stay here as long as you need. If it turns out I'm not your father, I'll still help you both figure out a stable living situation." Luke pursed his lips, brow furrowing. "You mean like you'd pay for an apartment somewhere and just walk away?" The question carried a note of challenge, but Charles heard the vulnerability underneath. "I don't want to walk away," he said gently. "I'm saying, if the test tells us we aren't related, you still don't need to be alone. We'll decide together what's best." Eva's eyes glistened, and she turned her gaze to the floor. Charles suspected she might be recalling all the times they'd been forced to pack up and leave whenever money ran out. He wanted to reassure her, but words felt too thin. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know it's scary," he said softly, "but either way, you have a place with me. I meant what I said before. I'm not going to abandon you." A silence followed, charged with unspoken thoughts. Luke stared hard at the coffee table, as though it might reveal some hidden truth. Eva blinked back a tear, inhaling shakily. Eventually, Luke cleared his throat. "All right," he said at last. "Thank you. We appreciate it." Something in Charles's chest loosened. "We'll take it day by day," he said, offering a calm, small nod. "No rush. Now, how about we try cooking dinner tonight? It might be a mess, but we can see what happens." Eva lifted her head, eyes still shiny. "You cook?" "Barely," Charles admitted, a smile tugging at his lips. "But I can follow instructions. We can pick a recipe. If it's terrible, we'll order takeout." Luke almost grinned. "I'm up for it." Charles stood leading them into the kitchen. He opened a cookbook he'd received years ago as a well-intentioned gift but never used. Eva and Luke crowded around, scanning the pictures. They settled on a simple pasta dish with tomato sauce. Gathering ingredients from the fridge, Charles realized he hadn't even known he had fresh tomatoes until that moment. The well-stocked pantry was the work of his housekeeper, who visited weekly, ensuring he never ran out of essentials he rarely used. Soon the teens were chopping and stirring, occasionally bickering over how finely to dice the onions or how much salt to add. Charles hovered, offering to pour measured amounts of ingredients or fetch utensils. The atmosphere was surprisingly light, punctuated by small jokes and squeals when the sauce bubbled too much. For the first time, it felt like a home with actual inhabitants, rather than a silent showroom for a CEO who rarely paused his schedule. In the end, the pasta turned out decent, maybe a touch too salty, but more than edible. They dished it onto plates and carried them to the dining table. As they ate, Charles asked them about their previous schools, trying to pick up hints of their interests. Eva confessed a love for books, though she had never been able to bring many along with each move. Luke admitted an inclination for hands-on projects, though he hadn't had proper shop classes in a while. Charles listened intently, noting the passion that surfaced in their voices when they talked about subjects they enjoyed. The conversation eventually drifted to stories of Marissa, and Charles steeled himself, worried about what they might reveal. Eva recounted how their mother had once held down 2 jobs to keep them in a decent apartment. Luke added that she used to sing lullabies on the nights she got home before bedtime. Their memories, though bittersweet, offered Charles a glimpse of what he'd missed. He wished, fiercely and silently, that he could have been there to provide a steadier life, or at least to share in the moment of hearing Marissa's voice fill a tiny, lamplit room. When the meal ended, they cleared the table together, rinsing plates and setting them in the dishwasher. The normalcy of the chores did more to settle the tension than any conversation could. Charles noticed, with quiet gratitude, that Luke seemed less guarded now, and Eva's eyes looked more at peace. He suspected that cooking as a team had given them something tangible to focus on, a break from the swirling uncertainties of the DNA test. Nightfall found them gathered in the living room again, sipping glasses of water and flipping aimlessly through the channels until they landed on a classic comedy. They watched in amiable silence, occasionally laughing at the old-fashioned jokes. At some point, Charles looked over to see Eva's eyes drooping and Luke blinking heavily. Realizing they were both fighting sleep, he suggested they call it a night. Neither resisted. The twins rose, murmured goodnight, and wandered to their rooms. Charles lingered, still feeling the day's warmth despite his exhaustion. As the soft hum of the penthouse enveloped him, he replayed their dinner conversation in his mind, letting each detail cement itself. Whether or not the DNA results confirmed his paternal link, he couldn't deny that these two had found a place in his life. The realization came with a hush of humility, as if the universe had decided to remind him that all his corporate triumphs mattered less than the smile on a teenager's face when they felt safe. With a final glance at the city lights, he headed to bed. He pulled back the covers, thinking how surreal it was that Eva and Luke slept just down the hall, under the same roof. The anxious swirl of earlier days felt quieter now, replaced by cautious anticipation of what tomorrow might bring. He hoped for their sake that the test would reveal a link, but even if it didn't, a new kind of responsibility had taken root in him. He was no longer simply Charles Bentley, the CEO. He was also something else, something more fragile and profound, an anchor in a storm the twins hadn't asked to face. Before he drifted off, he found himself whispering a silent promise to the memory of Marissa. Whatever the truth might be, he would take care of these kids, just as she once had. And with that vow lingering in the edges of his consciousness, he finally let sleep claim him, uncertain yet strangely comforted by the understanding that tomorrow would bring them all another chance to find their footing in an unfamiliar world. Before going further in this story, please like and share if you find it compelling, and consider following along for more. When Charles awoke the next morning, a dull gray light filtered through the curtains. For a moment he lay still, disoriented by a fleeting dream in which Marissa's laugh echoed through a wide, sunlit house. His heart twisted as he realized it was just his subconscious, conjuring what might have been. Gathering himself, he slipped from the bed and changed into casual slacks and a comfortable shirt, deciding he would work from home again to be near Eva and Luke. He paused by the hallway mirror, noticing fresh lines beneath his eyes. The past few days had brought a type of emotional strain he hadn't experienced in years. That tension coexisted uneasily with an unexpected sense of hope, the kind that whispered there could be meaning beyond corporate success. Steeling himself, he made his way to the kitchen, determined to greet the day with some semblance of normalcy. Eva and Luke were already awake, sitting at the dining table with bowls of cereal and half-empty glasses of orange juice. They offered him tentative smiles when he entered. He noticed Luke had discovered an old laptop from the living room closet, its screen alight with a web browser. Eva still wore the green sweater she'd picked out, as though it gave her comfort just to have something new and soft against her skin. "Morning," Charles said quietly, pouring himself coffee. "You two are up early." Eva gestured at the laptop. "Luke found this. We were checking local school websites, looking at enrollment requirements." Charles's eyebrows rose with pleasant surprise. "That's great. Did you find anything promising?" Luke nodded, though his enthusiasm was muted. "There's a public school near here that looks good, but we'd need to prove residency or show guardianship documents, and they ask about transcripts." A pang of awareness shot through Charles as he remembered that the guardianship status was far from settled. "We can sort that out," he said. "Jessica is compiling school info as well. Once we know what's best, we can handle the paperwork." Eva's gaze slipped sideways, and Charles sensed the unspoken fear. All these plans hinged on staying here, on Charles still being a fixture in their lives after the DNA results. He took a slow sip of coffee and decided it was time for some honesty. "I spoke to Jocelyn," he began, choosing his words carefully. No updates yet from the clinic, but she reminded me it could be a couple more days. The twins exchanged uneasy looks. Charles set his mug down, forcing a thin, reassuring smile. I know it's hard to wait, but I don't want you to feel stuck. We can still prepare for school. And if we need guardianship forms or anything else, we'll figure it out. Luke closed the laptop, leaning back in his seat with a sigh. I just hate not knowing, he said. It's like this weight hanging over us. Eva nodded. We understand you've done a lot for us. It's just everything feels on pause. I don't want to keep holding my breath. Charles moved to stand at the head of the table, resting a hand on its smooth edge. I feel the same, he admitted. Waiting is the worst part. But I promise you, once we get those results, no matter what they say, we'll move forward together. I'm not walking away. His voice rang with conviction, and he hoped it would ease some of their tension. They nodded quietly, taking solace in his reassurance. Charles changed the subject to avoid dwelling on the test. What do you say we try something else in the kitchen today? Something for lunch or dinner? Maybe a new recipe or even just homemade sandwiches? Eva glanced at her cereal bowl with a faint smile. I wouldn't mind trying a dessert recipe. We saw a chocolate cake in that cookbook last night. Luke perked up slightly. Cake sounds good. Charles chuckled. All right, chocolate cake it is. But if the kitchen ends up a disaster, I'm blaming both of you. Their laughter, soft though it was, brought a trace of warmth into the room. Despite the cloud of uncertainty, there were rays of light in these shared moments. They finished breakfast in a more comfortable silence than before, each person lost in their own small sphere of thoughts, yet tentatively connected by the routine of a morning meal. After tidying up, Charles retreated to his office. He had scheduled a brief video conference with a potential manufacturing partner in Europe. Eva and Luke busied themselves in their rooms, presumably exploring the new clothes or browsing more school options. Sitting down at his large desk, Charles tried to focus on the business at hand. A manager from Berlin was presenting slides about updated production timelines, referencing shipping delays and cost estimates. Charles nodded mechanically, occasionally unmuting to ask a clarifying question. Yet behind every nod, his mind lingered on Eva, Luke, and the ticking clock of the DNA test. When the call ended, he found Jessica's report in his inbox. She had compiled a thorough summary of high schools in the area, both public and private, along with contact details for counseling staff, deadlines for late enrollment, and even references to programs designed for students who had fallen behind. He forwarded the document to the twins' email addresses, hoping it might give them a sense of control to research it themselves. As midday approached, he stepped into the hallway. The smell of flour wafted from the kitchen, and he discovered Eva and Luke sifting cocoa powder into a mixing bowl. Bags of sugar and baking powder crowded the counter. A quick glance at the recipe on the cookbook stand revealed detailed steps that neither teen seemed intimidated by. Luke was carefully measuring out tablespoons of butter, while Eva beat eggs in a separate bowl. Their concentration was palpable. Charles leaned against the doorway, marveling at how such a simple activity could bring them together in a way that felt both domestic and hopeful. Need any help? He asked. Eva glanced up, whisk in hand. If you want to measure the milk, she said, nodding at a carton on the counter, that'd be great. Grateful for a task that required his hands rather than his business acumen, Charles joined in. Together, the three of them measured, stirred, and tasted the batter, occasionally breaking into small smiles at the sweetness or snickering when a bit of flour puffed into the air. It took them the better part of an hour to prepare and pour the mixture into cake pans, then slide them into the oven. While they waited, they congregated around the living room. Luke turned on a music channel softly, and Eva flipped through the pages of the cookbook, analyzing frosting options. Charles studied the two of them with a sense of guarded awe. For a handful of minutes, none of them mentioned the test or the complexities that loomed. It was as though the clinking of mixing bowls and the swirl of sweet batter had conjured a protective bubble around them. Eventually, the timer buzzed. They rushed back to the kitchen, each grabbing an oven mitt. The cakes emerged golden at the edges, chocolate scent drifting thickly through the air. Ava tested the centers with a toothpick, smiling as it came out clean. "Yes," she whispered triumphantly, setting the pans aside to cool. Luke mock bowed, as if congratulating her expertise. With the cake cooling, they began to make frosting. It took some trial and error. Too much sugar at first, then a dash of milk to balance it. Charles found himself laughing out loud when the frosting nearly spilled over the rim of the mixing bowl. It felt good to laugh, a refreshing break from his constant internal vigilance. He realized that in just a few days the twins had managed to shake his rigid routine in a way that gave his life an oddly welcome unpredictability. When the frosting was finished, they gathered around to spread it on the cake's top and sides. Eva used a spatula with surprising finesse, smoothing the frosting into a neat, glossy coat. Luke teased her, pointing to small lumps, and she flicked a bit of chocolate onto his wrist in retaliation. Charles found himself playing referee, though he couldn't keep the grin off his face. "Well," he declared once they were done, "it looks like a real cake. I'd say we did pretty well for amateurs." Eva's cheeks glowed with satisfaction. "Should we slice it now or wait until later?" Luke eyed the confection, an eager glint in his gaze. "I'm good with now." Charles let out a laugh. "Let's do it. I can't think of a better midday meal than fresh-baked chocolate cake." They cut into it, each taking a generous slice. The first bite was decadent, a little too sweet but rich and comforting. Luke nodded approvingly, mouth full. Eva closed her eyes in delight. Charles savored his piece more slowly, the texture reminding him that sometimes the simplest pleasures carried more value than any corporate accolade. Watching the twins enjoy their efforts, he felt that warmth grow in his chest again, a small light pushing aside the shadows of doubt. After they finished, the three of them tidied the kitchen. Charles rinsed mixing bowls, Eva stacked plates in the dishwasher, and Luke wiped down the counters. He couldn't recall the last time he'd taken part in such a simple family-like chore. The synergy of it all felt foreign yet profoundly right. With the kitchen restored to order, they ended up in the living room, sprawled on couches and chairs. Eva tapped on the old laptop resting atop a coffee table, reminding Charles of the school information he had forwarded. "Do you want to go through it now?" he offered, nodding at the laptop. She shrugged, though not dismissively. "Maybe we can talk about it. I saw a few places that looked interesting. One has an arts program, and another seems more STEM-focused. Luke and I never got a chance to pick that kind of stuff before. We were always just stuck wherever Mom could sign us up." Luke folded his arms. "We never lived anywhere long enough to get comfortable. It'd be weird having choices." Charles nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "You do have choices now," he said softly. "We'll pick something that aligns with what each of you wants, not just what's convenient." Luke's gaze shifted from the laptop to Charles's face. Something unreadable flickered in his eyes, gratitude, hope, maybe even guilt for wanting something better than the scraps of the past. Thanks, he managed, his voice strained. "I know we keep saying that, but it's because we actually mean it." Eva closed the laptop gently. "I'd like to visit those schools in person," she said. "It might help us decide." Charles felt a swell of resolve. "Absolutely. I'll set up tours. We can go as early as tomorrow or next week, depending on their schedules. No pressure." No. Their talk meandered after that. drifting from schools to the city's neighborhoods, from local museums to the question of what they might do when the weekend arrived. Charles realized how each normal topic held a significance for the twins, basic freedoms and plans that had never been guaranteed before. He found himself longing to give them a sense of belonging that transcended any test result. Late afternoon arrived, bringing a gentle shift in the penthouse's light. Eva excused herself to read, while Luke flipped on the TV to watch a documentary about engineering feats, a detail that didn't escape Charles's notice. The boy seemed drawn to machines, problem-solving, and practical solutions. Perhaps that was something a specialized program could nurture. Charles retreated to his office to catch up on more emails. A few new messages flashed from Jocelyn, but none of them referenced the test. Instead, she wrote about potential guardianship routes, a delicate subject that reaffirmed how much hung in the balance. He responded politely, acknowledging her thoroughness, then leaned back in his chair, exhaling. For a moment, he let his eyes close, allowing the memory of the twins' laughter in the kitchen to wash over him. Cake, conversation, and a sense of fragile unity. These were the things that gave him hope. If the results confirmed he was their father, he would embrace it wholeheartedly, even though it meant redefining his life. And if by some twist he wasn't related by blood, he knew he would struggle to let them go. The bond was already forming, built on empathy, shared vulnerability, and the promise of stability they had never known. His phone chimed, jarring him from his thoughts. Another business matter demanded attention. Duty called, but he rose from the desk with fresh determination. He would juggle these responsibilities, but not at the cost of neglecting the sudden turn his life had taken. There was more at stake here than a corporate ledger. He stepped into the hallway. Distantly, he could hear Luke's documentary still playing, along with the quieter sound of Eva flipping pages in her room. Charles ran a hand across the back of his neck, absorbing the penthouse's hush. The next few days might clarify everything or complicate it further, yet after flour-splattered countertops and the sweet mess of chocolate frosting, he believed they could handle whatever came next. Tomorrow, he decided, they would take one more step. Maybe he'd show them around the city, let them see a museum or a library, and at night they'd return to a home that might not be perfect, but could offer refuge from the storms behind them. He thought of Marissa once more, her memory in that photograph at the funeral, and murmured a silent vow that he would do better for Eva and Luke than he had done for her. In a life often governed by ambition, this was the most vital resolution he had ever made. Before going further in this story, please like and share if you find it compelling, and consider following along for more. The next day dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight radiating across the skyline in golden streaks. Charles rose early, his thoughts darting between a new product pitch he had to review and the plan he'd formed overnight to introduce Eva and Luke to some of the city's cultural spots. All around him, the penthouse seemed brighter than it ever had. He attributed it to having company, a shared purpose that replaced the usual echo of empty rooms. He was already dressed in a casual blazer and loafers by the time the twins emerged from their bedrooms. Luke wore clean jeans and a zip-up jacket, while Eva had chosen a simple dress paired with sneakers. A faint hint of color rose on her cheeks when Charles complimented her outfit. Luke merely gave a small nod of acknowledgement when Charles said he looked ready for the day. "Hope you got enough sleep," Charles said, leading them to the kitchen. "I was thinking we could go to the Metropolitan Museum unless you'd rather see the natural history one first." Eva's face lit up. "I've never been to an art museum," she confessed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Mom always said we'd go one day, but it never happened." Luke placed a hand lightly on the counter. "Art's okay," he said, voice thoughtful. "But I'm more into, like, historical artifacts, ancient stuff. Charles grinned. Then you're in luck. The Met has entire wings dedicated to ancient civilizations, Egyptian temples, Greek statues, you name it. We can take our time, and if you decide you're bored, we'll head somewhere else. They agreed, so Charles arranged for the driver to bring the car around. He grabbed a bag of snacks to stave off hunger, ignoring the part of himself that wondered if he was overdoing it. He wanted the twins to feel free from constraints, at least for one day. As they slipped into the sedan, he noticed that neither Eva nor Luke looked quite as tense as they had when they'd first arrived. Perhaps the notion of exploring something new buoyed them above the uneasy current of waiting for the DNA results. Traffic was moderate as they wound through the city streets. The shifting sunlight glinted off tall buildings, and pedestrians bustled on the sidewalks. Eva and Luke stared out the windows, absorbing the spectacle of a metropolis they had never experienced on this scale. With each red light, Charles found his gaze flicking between them, watching their reactions. Every time Luke pressed closer to the glass to glimpse a street performer, or Eva craned her neck to see an ornate architectural detail, Charles felt a spark of pride, almost the way a tour guide might feel when visitors marveled at his hometown. Soon they arrived at the Metropolitan's grand staircase, where a gentle throng of tourists and art lovers bustled about. Charles led the way through the entrance, purchasing tickets and picking up a map that sprawled with countless galleries and exhibits. Eva clutched the slip of paper as though it were a treasure map. Luke studied it with keen interest, tracing possible routes with his fingertip. The first gallery they entered featured towering Greek and Roman sculptures. Marble figures loomed above them, draped in flowing stone robes and frozen in elegant poses. Eva's footsteps slowed as she passed a statue of Aphrodite, its features eroded but still graceful. Luke paused at a statue missing an arm, peering at the label to learn its origins. Charles let them wander, content to observe from a short distance. He couldn't help recalling that as a younger man he'd never found time to appreciate art. He'd been too busy chasing financial success. Now he wondered if he might have missed something vital. They moved into the Egyptian wing next, the sharp odor of ancient stone greeting them in dimly lit corridors. Glass cases displayed jewelry and pottery from a civilization long gone. Luke studied each piece with rapt fascination, lips parted as he read the descriptions. At the back of the exhibit, a reconstructed temple loomed, its hieroglyphics etched into massive blocks. Eva trailed her fingers lightly along the rope barrier, her eyes wide as though expecting the ancient stones to whisper secrets. "It's incredible," she murmured. "It's like stepping into a different world." Charles nodded. "I visited here once, years ago, but I never took the time to look carefully. Working in the city always kept me on the run." Luke glanced at him. "Guess you were too busy building an empire." A wry smile tugged at Charles's lips. "Something like that." He paused, then added quietly, "If I'd realized what I was missing, I might have slowed down." Eva offered him a gentle look, a trace of empathy shining through. The unspoken bond between them, this strange provisional family, felt more tangible than ever in the hush of the museum's ancient halls. They lingered a while longer, reading plaques and imagining how people once lived on the banks of the Nile. After a slow, meandering tour of more galleries, the trio ended up in a sprawling room dedicated to European painters. Sunlight filtered through skylights, illuminating oils and watercolors that depicted scenes of centuries past. A hush lay over the visitors, each absorbed in quiet contemplation. Eva paused before a painting of a woman in a garden, enthralled by the vivid color of blooming flowers. Luke studied a landscape of a rural village, tapping his foot as though deciphering the brushstrokes. Charles drifted behind them, content to let them explore without interference. When noon approached, they found a small cafe inside the museum. Eva peered at the menu overhead, while Luke hovered at a display of pastries, eyes brightening at the sight of chocolate croissants. Charles asked them to choose whatever they liked: salads, sandwiches, or sweets. They settled on a mix of fruit, pastries, and sandwiches. As they sat at a tiny round table, trays balanced precariously, Charles noticed the subtle changes in the twins. They seemed at ease here, less burdened by self-consciousness. The museum's quiet energy had lulled them into a calm focus on the present. Eva took a bite of her sandwich, glancing at Charles. "Did you ever bring my—" She stopped, seeming unsure if mentioning Marissa would hurt. "Did you ever bring her here?" Charles set his coffee down. "No," he said, feeling a pang of regret. "We mostly spent time outdoors, near lakes or parks, when I wasn't drowning in business calls. Marissa loved nature more than museums. I wish I'd thought to bring her, though. She might have enjoyed it." Silence settled, and he sensed they were both curious about his relationship with their mother, yet he worried about overwhelming them with more details. He told them what little he remembered of those days: a flurry of ambition, late-night discussions, and the eventual break that left him forging ahead while Marissa disappeared. Now each reflection felt like both a comfort and a reproach. After lunch, they roamed a few more galleries until Eva and Luke's energy flagged. The relentless walking had worn them out, so Charles suggested they head home. They rode back to the penthouse in thoughtful silence, the quiet hum of the engine underscoring their fatigue. Eva eventually rested her head against the seat, eyelids drooping, while Luke stared at the passing buildings as though memorizing them. Once inside, Eva excused herself to her room, explaining she wanted to jot down impressions from the day. Luke drifted to the living room couch, switching on the TV at low volume to watch a historical documentary he'd paused the night before. Charles poured himself a glass of water, mind swirling. The day had felt peaceful, a kind of truce from the tension overshadowing them all, but the respite was temporary. They were still waiting. His phone buzzed and his pulse skipped. Jocelyn's number lit the screen. He flicked his eyes to Luke, who was half watching the TV, half lost in thought. Taking a few quick steps toward his office, Charles answered in a subdued tone. "Hello?" "Charles," Jocelyn said, "I just received word from the clinic. The final results will be ready by tomorrow afternoon." He swallowed. "All right. Thank you for letting me know. Is there anything else?" A pause crackled over the line. "No, not at this moment. Just be prepared. It's possible they'll come in a bit earlier or later, but tomorrow is the target. Should I reach out to the twins directly?" Charles exhaled slowly, as if the air had turned heavier. "No, I'll handle it. They've been waiting anxiously. This means a lot to them." "I understand," Jocelyn replied, her voice gentle. "Let me know how you'd like to proceed once you have the results." They ended the call, and Charles hovered in the doorway of his office, the phone still warm in his hand. So tomorrow it would happen. The moment of truth. The knowledge burned away the calm he'd felt that morning. He pictured Eva and Luke's faces, the uneasy hope in their eyes, and wondered how he'd deliver the answer they craved. Steeling himself, he returned to the living room. Luke glanced over, noticing the tension in Charles's shoulders. "Everything okay?" Charles forced a reassuring nod. "Just some business updates," he lied softly, not wanting to rattle Luke prematurely. "I'll take care of it." Luke nodded and turned back to the TV, but the flicker in his gaze said he sensed something deeper. Deciding to give them a final day of peace before everything changed, Charles said nothing more. Instead, he sank onto a nearby chair, half listening to the documentary while his mind replayed Jocelyn's words. Tomorrow afternoon. Time moved sluggishly after that. Eva emerged, and they ordered dinner from a local Thai restaurant, talking politely about the museum's highlights. They never mentioned the looming test results, as though some unspoken agreement dictated they'd cling to the last shred of normalcy. Afterward, they sat around the coffee table, playing a board game that Charles's housekeeper had once brought, the laughter subdued but genuine whenever someone made a silly move. They parted for bed relatively early, each weighed down by fatigue and unsaid thoughts. In his room, Charles changed into pajamas and stared out at the city's nocturnal glow. Somewhere far below, New Yorkers chased their ambitions, oblivious to his personal drama. Perhaps in a different lifetime, he'd have continued ignoring life's subtleties, too engrossed in expansions and product lines to notice an unfulfilled promise. Yet with Eva and Luke under his roof, he felt each hour like a beat of destiny marching him toward a confrontation he both welcomed and feared. He closed his eyes, remembering the museum's vast halls. For centuries, artists had tried to capture life's fleeting essence on canvas and stone. He thought about the statue fragments, the ancient relics, the way everything eventually crumbled into memory. Tomorrow, he'd learn whether he was truly bound to these teenagers by blood or merely by circumstance and empathy. In either case, he told himself, he would not turn them away. Sleep eluded him for a long while. He tossed and turned, images colliding in his mind. Marissa's warm laugh, Luke's intent gaze on an Egyptian artifact, Eva's quiet wonder at a painting. When at last he slipped into slumber, his dreams remained hazy, filled with doorways he kept trying to open only to find them locked or empty inside. Morning would bring them closer to the answers. And by the following afternoon, they would no longer be stuck in limbo, whether that meant stepping into a new reality as an unlikely family or facing an abrupt fork in the road with no clear direction. Charles only knew that if they had to choose a path, he wanted to walk it alongside the twins, come what may. Morning arrived with a muted sky, the sunlight dulled by thick clouds that threatened rain. Charles woke abruptly, heart pounding from a vivid dream he couldn't fully recall, something about doorways in a long hallway, each opening onto a memory he wanted to change. He sat up, pressing his hand over his eyes, reminding himself that today was the day he'd likely get the DNA results. The weight of that realization sent his pulse racing, as though an invisible clock counted down inside his chest. He lingered in bed longer than usual, attempting to calm his breath. Outside his bedroom, the penthouse was quiet, no clink of cereal bowls or hushed chatter yet. He wondered if Eva and Luke still slept, or if they too lay awake, bracing themselves for whatever phone call might come. Finally, deciding he could not hide in his room all morning, he stood and changed into a dark sweater and simple trousers. Work obligations had become an afterthought. All that mattered was facing the uncertainty that had haunted them for days. When he opened his door, he nearly bumped into Eva, who stood poised to knock. She startled slightly, then offered a small smile. "Sorry," she said, voice hushed. "I was going to ask if we could do something until we hear from Jocelyn." "Of course," Charles replied, stepping aside. He could see the anxiety etched in her eyes, the way she fidgeted with her sleeve. "I'm guessing Luke's up too." She nodded. "He's in the living room reading. It's, really quiet. Neither of us slept well." Charles felt a surge of empathy. "I didn't either." He gestured for her to follow him. "Let's have breakfast. Maybe we can keep busy until we know more." They found Luke curled on the couch, flipping through a thick textbook about ancient civilizations, one he must have picked up at the museum gift shop. Though he held the book open, his gaze kept drifting to the window, as if drawn by every passing car. The tension in the air was palpable, an unspoken current swirling around them. Charles forced a reassuring smile. "Good morning," he said. "Hungry?" Luke shrugged, closing the book. "A little," he admitted, "but I mostly just feel wired." Eva sank into the armchair. "Same," she murmured. "It's hard to focus on anything else." Charles understood. He offered them a choice. "We can try cooking again, or I can order something. Maybe focusing on a task could distract us. But if you don't feel like it, that's okay too." They exchanged a glance. After a moment, Luke set the textbook on the coffee table. "Cooking might help," he said. "At least it worked before." So they gathered in the kitchen, scanning the cookbook for a simple breakfast recipe. Settling on French toast, they rummaged for eggs, milk, and a loaf of bread left over from the previous day. The routine of measuring ingredients and whisking batter provided a tenuous sense of calm. Charles wondered if the faint quiver in his hands as he held the mixing bowl was obvious to the twins. They seemed just as unsteady, each fighting to keep their movement steady and purposeful. Luke dipped slices of bread in the egg mixture while Eva heated a skillet. Charles offered quiet instructions, though he was hardly an expert. Soon the scent of warm cinnamon and frying butter drifted through the penthouse. A small relief spread among them as they flipped the slices, turning them golden brown. Charles laid out plates, and Eva sprinkled powdered sugar with careful precision. They settled at the dining table, nibbling the French toast in silence. Now and then, the phone on the counter seemed to glimmer in Charles's peripheral vision, a silent reminder that Jocelyn could call at any moment. Every time he reached for his glass of water, he noticed Luke's eyes flick to the phone. Eva sat stiffly, shoulders drawn tight. Charles attempted a little smile. "This is really good," he said, gesturing at the plate. "You both did great." Luke swallowed a bite. "Thanks," he replied, but his voice lacked enthusiasm. It was clear that all three of them struggled to muster any genuine cheer. The clock on the wall ticked methodically, each second bringing them closer to the unknown. After breakfast, Charles cleared the plates while the twins helped wipe down the table. He suggested they watch a movie or try a puzzle, but neither idea landed with much enthusiasm. Finally, Eva murmured something about wanting to listen to music. She slipped off to her room, leaving Charles and Luke standing in the kitchen, the overhead lights glinting off every reflective surface. "She's been anxious all morning," Luke said, voice low. "I mean, we both have, but Eva hides it. I don't hide it well." Charles set down the dish towel, fixing Luke with a sympathetic gaze. "There's no right or wrong way to feel," he said gently. "I'm on edge too, but no matter what we learn, we'll handle it." Luke stared at a smudge on the counter. "You keep saying that," he muttered, though without resentment. "You really mean it?" "Yes," Charles said firmly. "I do." Luke nodded, as if deciding to trust him in that moment. Without another word, he grabbed his book and disappeared into the living room. Charles, left alone, leaned against the counter and exhaled. The day had barely begun, yet the tension felt unrelenting. He glanced at his phone again, half wishing it would ring and half dreading the moment it did. Hours slipped by with excruciating slowness. Charles busied himself by reorganizing a few shelves in his office, but the sound of passing footsteps in the penthouse reminded him that Eva and Luke were drifting restlessly from one room to another. He considered making small talk or suggesting a board game, yet it felt pointless to pretend normalcy when everything hinged on a single call. Shortly after noon, as Charles returned from the bathroom, the phone buzzed on the coffee table, flashing Jocelyn's name. The sound shattered the silence like glass splintering. Eva and Luke, drawn by the noise, emerged from opposite ends of the hallway. Their eyes met Charles's, wide with anticipation. He raised a calming hand, though inside he was anything but calm. Then he answered, voice strained. "Hello?" Jocelyn's voice came in crisp and professional. "Charles, the clinic sent the final report. I have it on my desk." Charles's throat felt tight. "And?" She took a breath. "It confirms a 99.9% probability that you are Eva and Luke's biological father." He shut his eyes, absorbing the words, his heart lurching into a wild gallop. Relief, shock, and fierce protectiveness all collided in his chest. I see," he managed, forcing himself to remain composed. "Thank you." Jocelyn paused, her tone softening. "I know it must be a lot to process. We'll move forward with formal guardianship if you want to proceed that route. For now, though, I thought you'd want to know right away." Charles swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Yes, thank you," he repeated. "We'll talk soon." He ended the call and realized Eva and Luke were standing a few feet away, shoulders rigid, eyes latched onto him. Their expressions carried the silent question, "What did she say?" He struggled for composure, but a tremor broke in his voice anyway. "You're mine," he said thickly, words aimed at both of them. "The test shows I'm your father." Ava's hand flew to her mouth. For a long moment she stood there, teetering between shock and joy. Luke stared, eyes brimming, lips parted in disbelief. Then, almost without warning, both twins moved toward Charles and he opened his arms. They collided in a disjointed, hesitant embrace. Luke pressing his forehead to Charles's shoulder, Eva grasping his sleeve with trembling fingers. Charles encircled them, feeling the rapid thud of their hearts against his. Something inside him unraveled, replaced by an overwhelming sense of awe. No one spoke for several seconds, letting the emotion flow unhindered. The gravity of months, even years of uncertainty melted into that single crushing moment of validation. They were connected by blood and by something deeper, a bond that had formed even before the lab results. Still, hearing it confirmed was like releasing a breath none of them knew they'd held. Finally, Luke pulled back, blinking hard. His cheeks were damp with tears, though he tried to swipe them away. So we're not alone," he whispered, as if testing the statement's truth on his tongue. Eva sniffled, leaning her head against Charles' chest. "I can't believe it," she managed. "All this time, Mom never, she must have thought." Charles hushed her softly, stroking her hair. "We can figure out the past later," he said. "Right now, I just want you both to know I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Tears glistened in Eva's eyes, but a smile found its way through. Luke let out a shaky breath. His gaze flicked from Charles to Eva, and Charles saw in the boy's face a mix of apprehension and hope. "What happens now?" Luke asked quietly. Charles felt an unfamiliar thrill course through him, an urge to promise them everything. Yet he resisted a grand speech, knowing their trust was still fragile. "We do what families do," he said, voice thick with emotion. "We make plans. We get you set up at school. We make sure you have a home, and we keep building from there, together." Eva pressed her lips tight, tears threatening once more. "I never thought we'd have a stable life," she whispered. "I guess we do now." A wave of protectiveness swept through Charles. He marveled at how swiftly fatherly instincts came alive inside him, tinged with regret for the lost years, but determined to make up for them. "We do," he affirmed. "We do." They lingered in that circle of relief, arms still touching, hearts thudding. Eventually, Luke scrubbed at his eyes again and laughed, a startled, trembling laugh that spoke of release. Eva added a wavering giggle, and Charles found himself smiling so broadly that his cheeks hurt. The tension of the previous days splintered in an instant, replaced by a kaleidoscope of emotions: joy, yearning, relief, and a new brand of responsibility. After a time, they drew apart, glancing around the living room as though seeing it for the first time. Charles motioned for them to sit, leading them gently to the couch. He settled between them, an arm around each set of shoulders, not wanting to break contact. "I know there's a lot we need to figure out: paperwork, Guardianship, the legal aspects, he said. But we'll handle it. Luke nodded, hands clasped tightly in his lap. So you'll be our legal guardian? He asked, almost timid. Yes, if you're both okay with that, Charles replied, his throat constricting again. I want to be, if you'll have me. Ava pressed a palm against her heart, eyes glistening. We will, thank you. The sincerity in her voice anchored Charles to the moment. She blinked away tears and added, It might take us a while to get used to saying Dad, but... Her words stole his breath. Dad. He realized with a jolt that hearing that single syllable from their lips would be both jarring and indescribably precious. He squeezed their shoulders. Take all the time you need. We'll do this at your pace. Silence wrapped around them again, but this time it was a peaceful quiet, the hush after a storm. Charles allowed himself a moment to simply exist in that stillness, grateful beyond measure. Eventually he cleared his throat, glancing at the clock. Are you hungry? He asked, remembering their unfinished breakfast plates. We made French toast, but maybe we can have lunch, a celebratory lunch. Luke nodded slowly, a smile creeping across his face. Eva gave a watery laugh. Celebratory lunch sounds perfect. Charles rose, offering them each a hand. Then let's do it, he said. We'll figure out what we want, and tonight we'll talk about everything. School, your rooms, all of it. One step at a time. Together they moved toward the kitchen, an odd mix of tears and excitement still coursing through them. Charles felt as though they'd crossed a threshold into a new life, unsteady but undeniably theirs. The phone on the coffee table lay silent, its job done, while the skyline outside seemed to brighten, as if reflecting their collective sigh of relief. Somewhere, in another realm of memory, he hoped Marissa could see them, proud that the pieces of the puzzle she'd left behind were falling into place. Charles and the twins spent the remainder of that day in a state of subdued wonder, their moods buoyed by the revelation that they were, in fact, bound by blood. After agreeing on a celebratory lunch, they opted for a cozy Italian restaurant a few blocks away. The three of them slid into a quiet booth, glancing over menus none of them truly needed to read. Each was too preoccupied with unspoken thoughts to focus on the pages of pasta and pizza options. When the waiter approached, Charles quickly ordered a few dishes to share: bruschetta, gnocchi, a large margherita pizza. Eva and Luke nodded, relieved to let him handle the details. Once the waiter left, they sat in comfortable silence, letting the magnitude of the morning's news sink in. Eva broke the hush first, twisting her napkin between her fingers. So, does this mean we'll change our last names? The question hung in the air, charged with both hope and hesitation. Luke set his elbows on the table, leaning forward as though he too wanted to know the answer. Charles inhaled slowly. He hadn't thought through every practical detail yet, but it was clear the subject mattered. I'd be honored if you did, Charles said gently, but only if it's something you truly want. This is your decision, just like everything else. He paused, looking from Eva to Luke. If it feels right, then yes, I'd love for you both to become Bentleys. But don't feel pressured. It's about what makes you comfortable. Ava's eyes glistened. I think I'd like that eventually, she murmured. Our old name was Mom's maiden name, Lane. I loved her, but this is like a new start. Luke nodded, though his gaze lingered on the polished tabletop. I never really felt attached to the old last name, he admitted. But I'll wait a bit, just to make sure this all settles. Charles smiled, struck by the way both teenagers had grown more expressive in the last few hours. Take whatever time you need, he said. We'll handle the paperwork, talk to Jocelyn about the legal aspects, and figure out how to approach everything else. The arrival of lunch provided a welcome break from heavier topics. They passed around the dishes, Sampling the tomato-slick gnocchi and the fragrant pizza, conversation drifted to smaller concerns, favorite foods, random tidbits about past birthdays, even comedic stories of kitchen disasters that Charles once had when he first tried to cook for himself. The talk was gentle, free of strain, as though they recognized they'd earned a pocket of calm after so much waiting. Yet the undercurrent of change was there. Every once in a while, Charles caught Eva glancing at him with a warm curiosity, as if seeing him anew. Luke, too, would fall silent mid-laugh, suddenly reflective, as though stepping back to grasp the reality that he no longer had to wonder if he was wanted. Charles, for his part, felt an odd sense of anchoring. He had lived decades chasing goals, always with one eye on the next milestone. But at that table, all he cared about was ensuring these two kids felt secure. After lunch, they strolled home on foot, deciding the short walk would help them digest. The clouds overhead threatened drizzle, so Charles kept an umbrella in hand just in case. Eva pointed out pretty storefront displays, sometimes tugging Luke's sleeve and whispering a quick remark that made him grin. Charles stayed slightly behind, letting them lead the way. He liked watching them interact, seeing the private jokes they'd developed, the subtle protectiveness Luke still showed, and the quieter trust Eva placed in him. Their bond was clearly forged from years of relying on each other. Back at the penthouse, the doorman greeted them with a polite nod, and they rode the elevator up. Once inside, Charles noticed that tension still lingered in the air, but in a different form. It was the unease of stepping into a larger conversation about the future. Feeling the shift, he invited them to gather in the living room. The cityscape glowed behind the windows, clouds swirling darkly above tall buildings, but the atmosphere inside felt bright with possibility. Luke settled on one end of the couch, Eva at the other, leaving the center spot for Charles. They waited, eyes fixed on him, as though anticipating some official pronouncement. Clearing his throat, Charles leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I spoke to Jocelyn briefly about next steps," he said. "We'll need to formalize guardianship since you're both minors. That means some legal documents establishing me as your dad and ensuring you have full rights under my care, health insurance, schooling, all of that." Eva's mouth curved into a tight line. "Does that mean social services will get involved? We've, had bad experiences with them before." Charles's features softened. "In this case, it should be simpler. Jocelyn will handle the legal side privately. I'll need to provide proof of DNA, sign the relevant paperwork, and confirm living arrangements. Since you're already here, it's mostly a matter of making it official. No more bouncing around fosters or shelters." Luke exhaled visibly, relief washing over his face. That helps," he admitted. "We hated living in other people's spaces, never knowing when we'd have to leave." Charles felt a pang, imagining all the times they must have packed up on short notice, terrified of not having a roof over their heads. "I'm sorry you went through that," he said, voice cracking just enough to reveal the depth of his regret. "I wish I'd known sooner. But from now on, you can count on having a home here." They nodded in unison, tears barely hidden behind small smiles. A short silence followed, filled with the quiet hum of appliances and the faint drone of traffic far below. Then Eva cleared her throat. "About school," she began tentatively. "Do we keep the timeline we were talking about, checking out local options?" Charles nodded. "Yes. And I can arrange tours for next week if you're up for it. If it feels overwhelming, we could wait a bit, but I'd prefer not delaying your education any longer than necessary." Luke hesitated. "I don't want to jump into a big, fancy private school and feel out of place, but maybe a public school near here would be okay if they let us catch up on what we missed." "That's perfectly reasonable," Charles assured him. "In fact, we can talk to the guidance counselors, see if they offer bridging programs, and if you decide later you want something different, we can revisit it." He glanced from Luke to Eva, feeling a swell of pride that they were already considering these choices. The point is, you have options. You aren't stuck. They continued talking for half an hour, diving deeper into details about schedules, potential extracurriculars, even the question of college. Eva admitted she loved literature and might want to pursue writing. Luke spoke of a newfound interest in architecture and design. Charles listened closely, stunned by how much potential they carried, and how fleetingly close he'd come to never knowing. Eventually, the conversation wound down, replaced by a more companionable hush. Charles studied the twins, noticing their postures were lighter now, heads held higher. It seemed that learning the truth of their parentage had unlocked a small door in their hearts, letting them breathe. He dared to hope that the healing process might begin in earnest, though he knew the scars of their mother's secrecy and subsequent hardships wouldn't vanish overnight. As late afternoon blurred into evening, Charles ordered dinner from a neighborhood bistro. While they waited for delivery, they congregated in the kitchen, sipping sparkling water and sharing random stories. Luke brought up an old memory of Eva scolding him for sneaking candies at a foster home. Eva blushed, protesting that she was only trying to keep him from cavities. Charles teased them both, imagining a past where such sibling spats were the greatest worry they faced. He felt an irresistible ache for the years he'd missed, birthdays, inside jokes, milestones he had never witnessed. When the food arrived, roast chicken, vegetables, a basket of fresh bread, they turned the dining table into a place of slow, thoughtful conversation. Charles asked about their mother, treading carefully. He wanted to know her better, to understand her final years. Eva and Luke traded glances, sadness clouding their features, but they spoke openly, recalling how Marissa worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, how her health deteriorated in the last 6 months. She never told them exactly what was wrong, but a persistent cough and fatigue hinted at something serious. She passed quickly, leaving them with precious few answers. Hearing the details tore at Charles's conscience, but also solidified his resolve. He couldn't go back and rewrite that history, but he could shape tomorrow. "If you ever want to talk about her," he said, voice thick, "I'll listen, no matter how painful it might be." They thanked him quietly, their eyes reflecting a shared pain too deep for immediate solace. So he shifted the topic again, conscious they needed gentler ground tonight. They discussed television shows, must-try city restaurants, and whether Luke's fascination with architecture might translate into a trip to see historical buildings. The conversation carried them through the meal, no one rushing to leave the table. At last, the day's emotional toll caught up with them. Eva yawned behind her hand and Luke's eyelids drooped. Charles stood, ushering them away from the dishes. "I'll handle cleanup," he said. "You two get some rest. This has been a big day." They didn't argue, offering drowsy smiles of gratitude. Eva lingered briefly to give Charles a shy hug. Luke followed suit, awkward at first, but ultimately sincere. Once they disappeared down the hallway, Charles stared after them, heart aching with both loss and promise. He realized that in a single day, his role had shifted irrevocably from possibility to certainty. He was their father, and they were his children. The idea sent a mixture of awe and trepidation coursing through him. He turned to the kitchen, disposing of leftovers and stacking plates in the dishwasher, the mechanical tasks soothing his restless mind. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, the city lights shimmering through a thin curtain of water. He finished tidying, then moved to the living room, sinking onto the couch. He closed his eyes, letting the hush of the penthouse settle around him. The day had changed everything, yet in some ways it felt like the real work was only beginning. They would need to file paperwork, navigate school enrollment, and decide how quickly to integrate the twins into a life that was vastly different from the instability they'd known. Charles wondered if they'd ever call him Dad openly, or if the word would stick in their throats after so many years without him. and though his heart longed to make grand promises, he knew trust took time. Still, as the rain drummed a steady rhythm, he allowed himself to dream. He pictured sharing future holidays, perhaps guiding them through the complex world of adulthood, seeing them graduate, meeting their friends. The images fluttered and shifted, but they carried a sense of belonging that was new to him. A quiet voice in his mind said that no matter the obstacles, having a family to fight for was worth every sacrifice. He opened his eyes to the glow of the city and recalled that old photograph from Marissa's possessions, the one showing them as carefree young adults, ignorant of the childbearing secrets that would one day unravel. It struck him that she must have hoped for a moment like this, even if she never dared to speak it. Maybe in her final days she found some solace believing the twins would reach him. Perhaps a tiny seed of faith had survived. Blinking away the sting of unshed tears, Charles stood. He checked his phone, half expecting another text from Jocelyn about guardianship. There was nothing yet, only a blank screen that reflected his face. He set it aside, deciding the morning would be soon enough to plan the next steps. For tonight, he trusted that tomorrow would bring its own challenges and triumphs. He turned off the lights except for a single lamp in the corner. Then he headed to his bedroom, passing the closed doors to Eva's and Luke's rooms. He wondered if they slept already, or if they lay awake, overwhelmed by hope or haunted by memories of Marissa. Either way, they would face the new day together. With that thought, he entered his room and drew the curtains, letting the hush of rainfall lull him toward rest. The path ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in years, Charles Bentley felt he had a true purpose, one that transcended any corporate ledger and promised a deeper sense of belonging. That night, Charles Bentley barely slept, but his mind was no longer consumed by doubts. Instead, it bristled with possibilities of how he could help Eva flourish in her writing ambitions, of ways to channel Luke's fascination with architecture, and of building a life where all three of them felt bound by more than just circumstance. Every so often, he would glance at the quiet hallway leading to their bedrooms, marveling that it was no longer a place of solitude. A paternal protectiveness had taken root. Stronger than any corporate resolve he had known, he felt both humbled and invigorated by it. In the morning, he rose early and decided to surprise the twins with a modest celebratory gesture. Having never been adept in the kitchen, he chose something simple: pancakes. He carefully measured flour, whisked eggs, and tried not to scorch the batter on the griddle. Steam curled around him as he worked, reminding him of their previous cooking adventures. Though he nearly dropped the first pancake when flipping it, by the time Eva and Luke emerged, the kitchen smelled of warm butter and syrup. The sight of him, a successful CEO in pajamas with batter smudges on his wrist, brought a laugh to Eva's lips and made Luke grin. They piled into chairs at the dining table, the morning light slanting through panoramic windows. Charles served the pancakes with fresh fruit and juice, feeling more optimistic than he ever had before 9 a.m. Eva poured syrup on her plate with an eager smile. Luke immediately cut into his stack, taking a big bite and nodding with open approval. Charles exhaled, relief mingling with pride. It was a small moment, but one that felt monumental. When they finished, Eva helped collect dishes, and Luke wiped the table. Small gestures that reminded Charles they intended to be more than guests. They were a family now, even if the words still sounded new in his mind. School visits were next on the agenda, and he wanted to set them at ease before they stepped into another environment of unfamiliar faces. So he went over the day's plan, explaining that Jessica had arranged tours at 2 public high schools, each known for flexible intake policies and supportive counseling staff. Eva bit her lip, eyes flicking to Luke, but neither protested. They seemed ready for this next chapter, though Charles sensed the quiver of nerves beneath their composure. By mid-morning, they were on the move, riding in Charles's sedan through streets that shimmered with sunlight after yesterday's rain. The first school, East Park High, was a sprawling brick building with wide lawns and old oak trees. A friendly administrator met them in the front office, guiding them through corridors that smelled of pencil shavings and fresh paint. Eva gazed at bulletin boards advertising theater auditions and book clubs, while Luke slowed at the door of a mechanical workshop, peering in as if drawn by the hum of machinery. Charles watched them both with a mixture of anticipation and tenderness. This was a realm he had never navigated, forging a place for them in a school system they barely knew. They ended up in a cozy guidance counselor's room, where a bespectacled counselor asked polite questions about their academic history. Eva explained they had moved around, missing chunks of classes, and the counselor nodded, reassuring them that bridging courses and supplemental tutoring could help. Luke admitted he felt behind in math, but the counselor smiled, insisting that a customized plan would ensure he caught up. Charles listened, relieved that the school seemed willing to accommodate. He could all but feel Eva and Luke's tension receding as the conversation progressed. The second school, Riverview High, had a modern facade of glass and steel. The atmosphere buzzed with students weaving through bright hallways between classes. Eva's eyes lit up at the sight of a library featuring floor-to-ceiling shelves, and Luke craned his neck at posters advertising a robotics club. A different counselor gave them a tour, emphasizing extracurricular options ranging from creative writing seminars to engineering workshops. Charles noted the curiosity flickering in both twins' expressions as they asked questions about schedules, clubs, and the possibility of an after-school job. By the time they returned to the car, arms laden with brochures, Charles felt certain they'd soon decide which environment suited them best. Over a quick lunch at a nearby sandwich shop, they pored over the brochures. Eva read aloud about literature electives. Luke found a page discussing advanced tech classes. Charles answered what questions he could, reminding them they had no pressure to pick immediately. "It's your call," he said, sipping his iced tea. "We'll weigh the pros and cons together." He wanted them to own this decision so they'd feel empowered rather than displaced. They returned to the penthouse by late afternoon. The tours had left the twins excited but drained. Charles suggested an hour to decompress before gathering in the living room. During that break, he placed a brief call to Jocelyn, confirming his readiness to begin formal guardianship procedures. She promised to send the initial paperwork by the next day. With that settled, he found himself pausing in the hallway outside the twins' doors, marveling at how seamlessly they had integrated into a space he once viewed as nothing more than a personal retreat from the corporate world. When they reconvened, Eva and Luke had jotted down a short list of pros and cons for each school. Charles admired their methodical approach, feeling a twinge of pride. They walked through each point together, considering everything from commute times to the sense of community they'd observed. Riverview seemed to offer more specialized programs for Luke's technical interests, while East Park had a robust arts initiative that appealed to Eva's literary side. The conversation stretched on, comfortable and earnest, until they set the papers aside and lounged on the couch, the city lights gradually winking to life outside. Luke was first to break the lull. "I'm leaning toward Riverview," he admitted. "There's a robotics team. I've never had the chance to do something like that." Eva pursed her lips. "I did like the vibe at East Park, but the library at Riverview was bigger and they had a writing club too. Maybe we could both go there." Charles nodded. "You can always change if it doesn't fit. But I think it's great if you choose something that sparks your excitement." They agreed, at least tentatively, on Riverview. Charles found himself smiling so hard his cheeks ached. He realized that in one day they'd chosen a direction for their futures, a place to anchor themselves academically, even as they settled emotionally into this new reality. "I'll contact the school tomorrow," he said. "We'll set up enrollment with the guidance counselors. Once that's done, we just need to handle the guardianship process to make everything official. Eva scooted closer to him. Thank you, she whispered, for not hesitating. I know this is a big change for you too. Charles placed an arm around her shoulders, gaze flicking to Luke, who looked equally appreciative. You've changed my life for the better, he confessed, voice wavering with earnestness. I've chased success for years, but this is the first time I've felt a real sense of purpose. Eva's eyes shimmered and Luke swallowed hard. Neither spoke, but the gratitude radiating from them was tangible. They settled there, immersed in the quiet hum of the city beyond the windows. At last, Luke cleared his throat. Are you okay if we call you Dad now? He asked, almost shy. Or is that weird? Charles's heart thumped. He remembered Eva mentioning how odd it felt to say that word, how foreign it must seem. I'd love it, he said gently, but only if you're comfortable. Luke nodded, exhaling. I am, he said, testing the word under his breath. Dad. Eva smiled, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. Me too, she murmured. Dad. Hearing it spoken aloud brought Charles a rush of emotion he couldn't fully name, a mixture of joy and regret for all the years they'd lost. But mostly, he felt an overwhelming warmth, as if something in his life had finally clicked into place. I'm here, he said softly. Whatever you need, now and always. They spent the rest of the evening in an unhurried calm. Charles ordered a simple dinner, and the three of them ate on the sofa, half watching a movie but mostly talking. Eva proposed a weekend trip to a bookstore she'd heard about, and Luke wondered if they might someday travel to Europe to see the architectural marvels he'd only read about. Charles made no promises he couldn't keep, but he encouraged them to dream freely. He had resources and, more importantly, a willingness to invest in their futures that went far beyond finances. Night descended with a gentle hush. They said goodnight in a way that already felt more natural, Eva giving him a quick embrace, Luke offering a nod that hinted at deep affection. Once they disappeared into their respective rooms, Charles lingered in the hallway, marveling at how quietly life could shift from lonely to shared, from uncertain to hopeful. He returned to the living room, gazing out at the illuminated skyline. In the reflection on the glass, he saw a man who was no longer defined solely by business accolades, but by an unseen tapestry of love and obligation. If only Marissa could witness this moment, see the twins forging a brighter path than she ever dared imagine. Perhaps she'd find solace in knowing her children were safe at last. Before retiring, Charles stepped into his office to check for any messages from Jocelyn or Riverview High. He found nothing urgent, just a confirmation that guardianship forms were on schedule and that the school was ready to expedite enrollment. Setting his phone aside, he felt a sense of peace he'd rarely allowed himself before. The world no longer hinged on money and deals alone. It pulsed with a new dimension of meaning, one centered on two teenagers who called him Dad. At last, he switched off the lights and made his way to bed. The city's glow filtered through the curtains, and the hush of the penthouse was warm, not forbidding. Lying down, he listened to the soft rhythms of his own breathing, no longer haunted by regrets but energized by the prospect of guiding Eva and Luke toward a promising future. With them under his roof, trust growing each day, and the word Dad now spoken without fear, he felt ready to embrace everything fatherhood entailed: mistakes, triumphs, and the everyday wonder of family. He closed his eyes, letting the gentle thoughts of tomorrow cradle him into slumber.